Hey, hello. Welcome to me, never ever having painted in gouache before. So I decided to try it. Off the bat, I knew I would make a ton of mistakes, and the first one is coming up right here in a bit. Wait for it. And there you go. I put way too much water in my first attempt at the first coat. And then I just decided to give myself a break and not be too pressurized about the whole situation and just do a kind of underpainting wash on all the little skulls that I was attempting to paint. I was extremely uncomfortable with starting to try this media because the last time I tried it must have been in like 2006 in a 101 painting class in school, and I absolutely hated it. I just remember thinking, why would you not just paint an acrylic? Why would you go to all these lengths with this difficult media? I don't get it. I hate it. I'm never doing it again. But I have since matured from that mindset, and I've realized recently that the only way to get better is to try things that you're really bad at. And so this is what I'm doing. And I've watched how other people have said that the paint changes color temperature, and the darks dry light and the lights dry dark. And that's something that does not happen with acrylic. Acrylic is just so solid, like what you see is what you get all the way through. And so introducing a more gouache type substance into my practice is going to make me see color way better. It's going to give me an opportunity to practice my values and to the anticipatory thoughts that happen when you are creating an artwork. And developing that skill is, like one of the best things that you can do for yourself in improving your art. I feel as though no matter how well versed I am in other medias, because I've been doing this for a while, I always got to respect the new material that I'm working with, and it's going to have properties that I have probably not encountered before. It was kind of cool because I felt that sort of beginner anxiety that I have not felt in a long time. Like, am I doing this right? Am I mixing it right? Are my colors okay? Like, how do I use the brush? Like, it got me back into that mindset of realizing that, holy shit, I used to be an absolute novice at every single thing I've ever done. So it actually was a great reflection period for me as well. Like, during this time, I was not only thinking about the shape and the structures and the colors that I was using, but I was always reflecting on my time as an artist and how I've kept growing and developing my skills, and how sometimes it was way more difficult to translate into this new media of gouache than I actually gave credit to. It was much more frustrating and much more tedious than I had initially imagined the whole experimental process to be. And the other thing was that I didn't know how to start. I recalled that sense of being frozen, of like, where the hell do I even begin with this? And for this one skull that I'm working on right now, it turned into an absolute disaster. Not just because I didn't trust myself, but also I ended up pushing it way too far. This guy that I practiced on, I should have just left him. But no, it wasn't perfect, and my ego got the better of me. And later in the video, you'll see my return to this guy and trying to change it into what I thought was going to be better, but just ended up being an absolute mess. And now that I look at this in retrospect, I'm like, hey, that's not that bad. Just like, let it go, move on. But no. Our egos are massive when we're trying to get something to look right. However, I'd have a few good seconds of feeling like I had a handle on it, and then doubt would creep back in right away. And so that's why I sort of jumped around and practiced on all these different skeleton drawings. Instead of just sticking to one, really, I bounced around because I just wanted to fight that feeling of fear, basically, that came up, even though I was relaxed, I was painting. It was supposed to be no stress, but when you're trying something new and you're not sure how it's going to turn out, it starts to cascade into all these other deep questions we have as artists in ourselves. And we're like, are we good enough? Is this good enough? How have I been drawing for 20 years and it still looks like crap? All that starts to arise. It's kind of fascinating, actually. Another mistake I really made was not planning out my color structure beforehand. I'm someone who works kind of intuitively, but I think I mistake intuition for experience. So I know what I'm doing with other kinds of media, but for this one, as I worked along, I realized that I had a weaker understanding of planes and values than I, conceptualized for myself. And for making work in a new media like gouache, I was so insecure that I realized that in the next few sessions I want to do is I want to plan it out much more consistently. I want to figure out what colors I'm going to use first before I even sit down to paint. And that's a different kind of working style for me as well. So all these kinds of ideas and questions were sort of surrounding my headspace at the time, while cursing how I wasn't getting what I had envisioned. But this guy turned out okay. I was feeling a little bit back in the game here because I had the red wash initially, then I went over it with the green. And so it seemed natural to me to continue in that sort of red-green complementary back and forth for the final layer. So I went a little softer and went with tans and oranges, some browns. And then I started to this time I actually took the skull out and I was looking at it in person, which, just goes to show how much observation can make a difference in your final product of whatever you're trying to capture here. I'd have to say that I enjoyed working on this one the most. It was where I felt the most comfortable. I was seeing the planes and the values much more clearly, especially since I was working from life, and I had a fairly decent underpainting to go off of as well. And this is where I really started to enjoy blending the paints and making the different values appear. I actually stopped overthinking, I stopped being anxious, and I was starting to get into the flow of this new media that I'm trying. At about this point, I was really in the groove and I was really throwing out any kind of personal expectation I had of myself of whether this was going to turn out good or bad. I think because it felt like it was working and I felt like I was getting a handle on how the paint was mixing and how I could use it to my benefit and to my ease. That's the most important thing to me, is to have a sense of comfort with whatever material I'm using. And then I made some other distinct color choices for making the skull show up and, pop out from the background, apart from the white paper that I was using. I was using hot press, and so this sort of stylized look is not really a characteristic of my work in general, but that's the thing. Yeah, I love doing things that don't look particularly like my art. I like experimenting and I like trying different styles and medias, and I feel like that's how I improve the most, is to do something outside my comfort zone. All right, well, we're back at the skull that I should have left well enough alone. So the other mistake I made with this, first of all, it was fine. I should have just left it and started a new one. But that perfectionism really, kicks in. That's just something that I get obsessed with. I think my major problem with this one was not deciding on what type of green I wanted the skull, because I was kind of getting fascinated with all the different kinds of mixes I was getting and the tonal variations that were happening. And I really should have just let myself play a little bit more with swatches or something. because at first I wanted like a muted kind of green with nice highlights, but then I sort of got into my head that I wanted an electrified look, and that comes a little later when I introduce the cyan blue into the mix. I wasn't looking at the skull that I had in front of me, and I was just sort of playing with what was going to pop out for the background, and it just became a huge mush. There were a number of places where I could have stopped and it would have been okay. Like here. Like maybe after I did the highlights there, I could have bumped down the eye sockets to some darker values and then called it a day. At this point, it just started to be really overworked and it was just getting too mushy, and the values and planes were not separated enough. The form was disappearing. You know, you have to do some of these things to learn that you should never do that again. And at this point, I was just grasping at straws to make this come into a form that I appreciated, but it never happened. The upside is that I really enjoyed just making those painterly marks and using my brush on the paper. Just that sensation alone, you know, was reward enough for my crappy skull painting that I have right here. Overall, my impressions are really good. I am quite taken with this new media that I've discovered. Hopefully in the future, I'm going to go full gouache and not the baby step 2 gouache. They probably have very similar characteristics, but this was an interesting experiment, and it actually humbled me a lot, remembering what it really takes to stay committed to something when you don't know too much about it.